Most speakers do one of two things when it comes to using the stage. Either they stand completely still most of the time, or they pace back and forth most of the time. Neither one is ideal. Keep in mind what Patricia Fripp told me, and again I'm paraphrasing, but she said something to the effect of, people won't remember what you say as much as they'll remember what they see when you say it. In other words, we need to make our speeches visual. Part of how we do this is with our words, but the other part is through our movement. My advice for movement is this: do what the story tells you to do. If there's action in the story, do what the story tells you to do. If there are 2 locations in the story, set up a spot on the stage for each location. If you're telling a story about standing in line, guess what? You probably won't need to move as much. Take a look at the video for a lesson on what I see are the 2 major reasons for moving on stage. At the end of it, ask yourself, where will I place everybody and everything on my stage for this specific story? You'll see what I mean. This video gives you the lesson, so I'll see you in the next lesson when we move on.
Now here's how I used to tell this story. I'd be walking back and forth. I created my scene, but then I'd walk back and forth like this, telling the story the same exact way. If you walk back and forth, what does that do to your scene? Demolishes it. And sadly to say, most speakers walk all over their scene. We have to move with a purpose. And there are 2 major purposes for movement. The first major purpose for moving is this: an action in your story prompts the movement in your speech. An action in your story prompts the movement in your speech. In other words, I got to go talk to my wife about this. Here's my wife. Okay? And I looked him in the eyes and I came back, so I transitioned. You've got to remember where you put everybody and everything. This is very important. As Walt knows, because he's been to some boot camps. We do speaker boot camps around the country, and one time I had a guy come up and do his speech, and it was a very touching speech, very touching. His uncle passed away, and they held the funeral right here. Then he went away and told some more parts of the story. Then he had lunch right here. And as sad as the story was, I had to say, look, I got to tell you this. Do you realize you just had lunch on your uncle? You got to remember where you put everybody and everything. My good friend Darren LaCroix calls them holograms. Remember where you put these holograms so that you don't step on them or end up having lunch on your uncle. Okay, so one reason for movement is the action in your story prompts the movement in your speech. Another very important reason for movement, we want to use the stage as a timeline. Timelines. We read from left to right, correct? Read from left to right. So we want to use the stage as a timeline. I tell a story here, and I sell my point or I make my point, guess what I do? In a keynote address, I'd go to another spot on stage. And as I'm transitioning, I use a transitional statement like this. Fast forward with me 8 years. I'm walking up the timeline. Okay? Tell my next story, make my next point. Over the next 2 decades, what I came to understand was, and what this allows you to do is call back to those other points. 3 stories, 3 points. By the time I finish my speech, I can say, just like when I was 10 years old, call back visually and verbally. This happened. Just like when I was 18, this happened. And just like today, and I go into my closing, that is a speech I would pay to see.